In the spring of 1763, the Great Lakes stood on the edge of revolt. The long war between Britain and France had ended, but peace had not reached the frontier. From the St. Lawrence to the Ohio, native nations watched as red-coated soldiers replaced French garrisons and English traders pushed deeper into their lands. To British officials, this was the natural order of empire. To the Odawa, the Ojibwe, the Delaware, and a dozen other nations, it felt like conquest without consent. When the French flag fell at Detroit and Mackinac, many native people believed old alliances would continue: friendship, gift exchange, and trade that kept the balance. But the British under General Jeffrey Amherst saw diplomacy as wasteful. He halted the giving of presents, restricted gunpowder sales, and demanded that tribes submit to new rules. What Amherst saw as discipline, native leaders saw as betrayal. And so the Great Lakes grew tense. Settlers from Pennsylvania and Virginia began to spill into the Ohio country, cutting timber, fencing meadows, and claiming hunting grounds that native nations had never ceded. It appears, one observer wrote, as if the English mean to cut us off the face of the earth. Amid this turmoil, a spiritual movement spread. A Delaware prophet named Neolin, the Enlightened One, taught that the Creator, the Master of Life, was angered by the ways of the Europeans. He urged all Indians to cast off rum, clothing, and weapons of the foreigners and return to the old path. "If you drive out these dogs clothed in red," he said, "your land shall again be happy." His words spread along the rivers and through the forests. Among those who listened was an Odawa war leader from the Detroit region, Pontiac. Pontiac had fought beside the French during the 7 Years' War. He had seen their defeat, and he knew what British rule would mean. In his mind, Neolin's message was not just religion, it was strategy. The tribes of the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley had to unite, or they would disappear. In April 1763, as the ice broke on the Detroit River, Pontiac called a council along the E-course. Representatives from many nations arrived: Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Huron, Miami, and Shawnee. Pontiac rose and spoke. The Master of Life, he said, was displeased. The English treated them as slaves. The time had come to drive them out. "It is important for us, my brothers," he warned, "that we exterminate from our lands this nation that seeks to destroy us." The council agreed. When the first leaves opened on the trees, they would strike every British fort at once, from Lake Superior to the Ohio River. On May 7, 1763, Pontiac and 300 warriors approached Fort Detroit under a flag of friendship. Hidden beneath their blankets were muskets, meant to be drawn once inside the walls. But Major Henry Gladwin, the British commander, had been warned. The gates were closed. The trick failed. Pontiac withdrew and surrounded the fort. The siege of Detroit had begun. For more than 5 months, the fort held under constant threat. Smoke rose from the riverbanks where hundreds of warriors camped. Supply boats were ambushed. On July 31st, a British column attempting to reach the fort was trapped along Parents Creek. The water ran red that day, earning the name Bloody Run. Pontiac's warriors withdrew only after heavy British losses. Detroit never fell, but the countryside belonged to Pontiac's alliance. Across the Great Lakes, the war spread like wildfire. Within weeks, small garrisons fell in quick succession. Fort Sandusky in Ohio, burned. Fort St. Joseph in southwest Michigan, taken by the Odawa. Fort Miami in Indiana, gone. Then, in early June, came the most daring blow of all. At the fort, on the Straits of Mackinac, Ojibwe and Sauk warriors invited the unsuspecting British to watch a game of bag-it-away, the fast, brutal contest we now call lacrosse. The players slammed the ball toward the open gate. As it rolled inside, they rushed through after it. Women watching from the sidelines handed them hidden weapons. In moments, the fort was theirs. The Ojibwe spared the French traders but killed or captured nearly the entire British garrison. The story of the lacrosse ruse would become one of the most remembered episodes of Pontiac's war. By midsummer, only 3 British strongholds in the region remained: Detroit, Fort Pitt at present-day Pittsburgh, and Fort Niagara near Lake Ontario. All others had fallen. At Fort Pitt, the siege turned desperate. Inside the walls, hundreds of soldiers and frightened settlers were short of food and surrounded by Delaware and Mingo warriors. On June 24th, British officers met with Delaware emissaries to negotiate. They handed them 2 blankets and a handkerchief from the smallpox hospital. General Amherst himself had written, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among the disaffected tribes?" Whether this act spread the disease directly is still debated, but smallpox did strike native communities that summer, and the attempt remains one of the earliest recorded cases of biological warfare. Relief finally came through open battle. Colonel Henry Bouquet, leading 400 soldiers, fought his way through Pennsylvania's wilderness in early August. Near a place called Bushy Run, he lured the attackers forward by feigning retreat, then turned and counterattacked. The native forces withdrew. Fort Pitt was saved. By autumn, the war had reached its turning point. The British Crown, alarmed by the collapse of its frontier, tried to calm the storm with diplomacy. On October 7, 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation. It drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains and declared that all lands westward would remain for the use of the Indians. Colonists were forbidden to settle there without royal permission. On paper, it was a sweeping recognition of native sovereignty. In practice, it was nearly impossible to enforce. But for Pontiac and his allies, it was proof that the Empire had heard them. Still, the fighting continued into the following year. In 1764, Colonel John Bradstreet sailed from Niagara to Detroit, making peace with tribes along Lake Erie. Colonel Bouquet pushed deep into the Ohio country, forcing Delaware and Shawnee leaders to return more than 200 captives, men, women, and children taken during raids. The British regained the forts, but not through conquest, rather through negotiation and the slow exhaustion of both sides. In 1765, at Fort Detroit, Pontiac met with British officers to discuss peace. The Empire promised to resume fair trade and halt settlement west of the mountains. The native leaders agreed to end the war. A year later, in July 1766, Pontiac traveled east to Oswego, New York, to meet Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs. There, before a great assembly, Pontiac laid down his war belt and pledged loyalty to the king, on the condition that Britain respect the rights of native nations. For a brief moment, peace returned to the frontier. But history rarely stands still. Within 2 years, colonists began crossing the mountains again. British garrisons lacked the will to stop them. Treaties redrew the lines farther west. Pontiac, disillusioned, withdrew to the Illinois country. In 1769, he was murdered near Cahokia by another native man, perhaps in a quarrel over politics, perhaps at someone's urging. His death sparked violence between tribal factions, a tragic coda to his dream of unity. The human toll of the war was immense. Hundreds of British soldiers were killed. Frontier families fled eastward, abandoning farms and villages that had been burned to ash. In the Ohio Valley, retaliatory raids by colonists wiped out entire native communities, men, women, and children slain without distinction. The war left scars that lasted for generations. Yet its outcome was remarkable. Though Britain held its forts, it reversed nearly every policy that had sparked the rebellion. Amherst was recalled in disgrace. Trade restrictions were lifted. Gift-giving resumed. The proclamation line, however weakly enforced, acknowledged for the first time that indigenous nations possessed land rights the Crown was bound to respect. In that sense, Pontiac's War achieved what few native uprisings ever did. It forced an empire to change course. For the indigenous nations of the Great Lakes, it was not a failure, but a lesson in power. They had fought the greatest army in the world to a standstill. The Odawa, Ojibwe, Delaware, Shawnee, Miami, and Wyandot had proven that unity could hold the line against colonization, at least for a time. In later years, leaders such as Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and Tecumseh would recall the example of Pontiac's alliance as they faced new waves of American settlers. For the British colonists, the war carried another lesson. Many were outraged that the Crown now barred them from the rich lands of the West. The same decree that sought peace with native nations sowed anger among colonists hungry for land. That resentment of royal control and frontier limits became one of the sparks that lit the American Revolution a decade later. In that sense, Pontiac's War reshaped not only the Great Lakes, but the destiny of two continents. Today, traces of that conflict linger in the names we pass every day: Pontiac, Michigan, Pontiac Lake, and the echoes of native homelands beneath them. At Mackinac, visitors still watch reenactments of the lacrosse ruse that toppled a fort. In Detroit, where Pontiac once camped outside the walls, the city has long outgrown the stockade, but the story remains rooted in its soil. Historians now view Pontiac not as a rebel, but as a statesman and visionary. He understood that survival required solidarity, that no single nation could withstand the weight of empire alone. His rebellion, or defense as some call it, was the first great pan-Indian movement on this continent. The war's deeper legacy lies not in the forts taken or the treaties signed, but in the enduring idea that indigenous nations have the right to their land and the strength to defend it. In 2013, descendants of Pontiac and allied tribes gathered at Council Point Park, near Detroit, where the first council had been held 250 years earlier. They carried an eagle staff in his honor. Drums sounded along the river, and an Odawa elder spoke of the unity their ancestor had built. 2.5 centuries later, the words of Neolin and Pontiac still carry weight. They remind us that resistance is not just war, it's the insistence on dignity, identity, and belonging in one's own homeland. Pontiac's War began as a revolt. It ended as a reckoning. It forced a powerful empire to listen, and for a fleeting moment, the Great Lakes stood as a shared world again, neither conquered nor free, but fiercely alive with the will of those who refused to vanish. Thanks for listening. Please share and follow End of the Road in Michigan for future episodes.